Hey guys, Caleb here, and welcome to I Love Fanfiction. When we did Sparking Tickle, it was intended as an episode of Bad Fanfiction Theater. However, Hushicho and I really enjoyed the story, and it technically had no flaws. Topless Robot just didn't like the fact that it was Shota. And while Shota isn't for everybody, it ended up accidentally being the first episode of I Love Fanfiction. Since we had prepared ourselves for Sparking Tickle to be a Bad Fanfiction Theater episode, I didn't have the chance to explain what I Love Fanfiction is. I Love Fanfiction is a show to counter Bad Fanfiction Theater. I don't think anyone has done dramatic readings of stories they like, at least that I know of, and I want to show off the other half of the fanfiction world. It's not about bad stories, it's about writing good stories. And it's not even about writing perfect stories, because perfect stories don't exist. Close to perfect, yes, but even the best stories will still have flaws. The problem I face doing a show like this is that, unlike with Bad Fanfiction Theater, what can be considered good is purely opinionated. If you watch Bad Fanfiction Theater, you know that I mentioned I have no problem with Shota, and will give a story like Sparking Tickle high remarks, whereas some people, like Topless Robot, will put it on a worst top 10 list. That said, what I'd like is not what you like, and vice versa. Because of that, I don't think I'll be able to take requests as easily as I can on Bad Fanfiction Theater. But if you have a story you really think is good, and I mean good, written well, characterized well, concepts are decent, that kind of good, please feel free to recommend it. The stories I read here are going to be ones that I personally enjoy and recommend. I'm also likely going to be the only one reading these stories, so I'm really sorry for how boring these readings are going to be. But Hushicho doesn't share my love for murder mysteries or rape fantasy stories, and these definitely aren't Hawk's cup of tea either, so I'm gonna be alone for this one, guys. As for format, these are going to be your typical dramatic reading, if you've watched any other dramatic readings on the internet before. It will follow standard format of Bad Fanfiction Theater, that being introduction, reading, and then summary. But it won't contain jokes or random chatter like the other shows. Think of these more as audiobooks. I think the word now is podfic, but I'm not sure. Just like Bad Fanfiction Theater, if I feel there is triggering offensive subject matter, I will warn for it. Keep in mind, I like the darker side of human nature, so there will be a lot of non-con murder and other things. Now that we got that spiel over with, on to the fanfic. Today, we're going to read Drought by Evil Asian Genius, which is a Tatsumi Nagare / fanfic from the Yami no Matsue fandom. Let me do a quick introduction to Yami no Matsue and then the featured characters of this fic. The protagonists of Yami no Matsue are Shinigami who work for the Ministry of Hades. Shinigami are people who have died, but still have strong attachments or reasons for not moving on to the afterlife. Not to say Shinigami aren't in the afterlife, which is a reflection of the real world, but they don't stay there and they do not have a blissful existence. Many Shinigami and others that work in the ministry are haunted by the things they did in life. Specifically, the ministry uses the summons department to investigate when people fail to die, or when souls fail to move into the afterlife to be judged. They also investigate when people die who are not supposed to, such as mass murders when it's believed to be by supernatural means. In the former case, a Shinigami's job is to make sure that the soul is taken to judgment by any means necessary. Yes, it means they will aid you in suicide, or by killing you outright if you fail to die. Shinigami in the story are all rather nice people, but they all have their own dark reasons for taking this job, as I've said before. In a nutshell, is a murder mystery supernatural series where Shinigami are in the place of police officers, not evil in nature, but viewed more as a necessary evil. Seiichiro Tatsumi once worked as a Shinigami, but he quickly found himself more at home as a secretary for the summons department. He is known to be a penny pitcher and once was called the Devil by Tezuki after Tatsumi docked his pay again for destroying the newly built library. Again. In life, Tatsumi was raised by his mother, who came from a noble samurai family, but they were poor and their title meant nothing to anyone but them. Tatsumi is serious, at times sadistic, and hard-working, but he also cares deeply for many of the other characters and will attack those who would dare make his friends' lives a living hell. Nagare Kurosaki is the father of Hisoka, the secondary main protagonist of the series. He and his pregnant wife are plagued by strange illness. In Nagare's case, he is covered in scale-like skin and going blind. He comes from an old noble line of samurai much like Tatsumi, and the Kurosaki line is said to have slain a snake god and been cursed by it. Nagare, being from such a noble line, is very traditional. As such, Nagare isn't interested in sharing family secrets and traditions with strangers, and neither is the rest of the family. I forget why, but Watari, another Shinigami, is sent to investigate the Kurosaki family. Since Watari doesn't have a partner and Shinigami are required to work in pairs, Tatsumi goes with him as everyone else is busy. Watari and Tatsumi masquerade as a doctor and assistant, observing and investigating the family. Tatsumi soon takes up a fierce loyalty to Nagare despite learning a few of the dark secrets the family has been hiding. And that's where the manga is right now. We are reading Drought, a Yami no Matsui Descendents of Darkness / fanfic featuring Tatsumi and Nagare on fanfiction.net by Evil Asian Genius. There will be a link down in the description if you want to follow along. Flowers droop their burden of raindrops, a profusion of colors melting against a gray sky. Somewhere far away, a shock of lightning, a rumble of thunder in the low afternoon twilight. He looked up, felt the shiver of shadows as the rain fell, the rigidity of wood and paper, the round little shadows paving the tatami floor with a soft rough cobble, overlaying the floor. But it was all gray, fuzzy, and indistinct, a blur of feeling lacking certainty. He sat undignified, long legs sprawled, watching the raindrops fall in his inner courtyard, strange and overgrown. Since it had been formal, rigid, manicured with precision, but nature had taken its course over the years of neglect. Trees grew with wild abandon, hung over the green tendrils of crawling vines, the koi pond long overgrown with weeds and lotuses, their roots dangling through bleaching fish bones. Tatsumi turned the teacup around in his hands, once, twice, looked at the swirl of iridescent blue and green and gray, thought about the smooth pebbled surface, admired the art with one eye for the aesthetic and one eye for the reality of this haunted place. The house was quiet but for the murmur of rain. Rui must be sleeping, he thought, exhausted to the point of sleep, drugged with opiates. He ran the possibilities through his head. Whatever it was a welcome break. Often her voice woke him in the night, set his heart pounding as she called for Nagare, called for a savior that would never come, and was probably never much of a savior in the first place. He sighed and set the cup down. As he watched the tea turn cold, trailing steam, slowly dying until it was nothing but a slick bright surface of water. Days like this reminded him of his youth. It was easy to lose himself in old memories of another worn-out house, another grand estate torn by time and by poverty, empty halls shrouded in dust, sealed rooms taut with the breaths of ghosts, paper walls slowly disintegrating from mold and disuse. He took himself from the past like a man trying to fling off cobwebs. Footsteps. He hadn't noticed them until they were nearly at the door. "You're slipping," he said to himself as he folded his legs properly under him, sitting up straight. The door opened, and he was not surprised. "Master?" He nodded politely. Oh, Nagare looked genuinely surprised. I didn't expect to find you here. Flinching, he drew his yukata closer about himself, as if girding himself for war. Tatsumi moved to stand. I'll go. No, it's all right. Nagare made a little dismissive gesture with his hand, and Tatsumi sat back down. To be honest, I could use the company. His mouth moved, wry, something that was almost like a smile, but not quite. If you don't mind, then, and Tatsumi frowned to himself, seeing Nagare tense up, retreating behind the stone facade of his face. Nagare sat beside him, settling the long loose folds of his yukata, an absent, thoughtless gesture. Tatsumi fussed with his shirt sleeves, brushed off a tiny piece of lint, and eyed Nagare's sharp profile curiously as Nagare called for tea, watched the servant make it and serve it to the both of them, and dismissed her with the same indifference. After she left, Tatsumi became even more aware of the silence, the pattering rain darkening the sky, the soft sliver of the shifting shadows of Nagare's bandages. He glanced over out of the corner of his eye. Nagare sat with his hands wrapped around the ceramic cup, twin to Tatsumi's own, head bent down slightly over it. His mouth was half open, over the rising steam, as if he was sipping the fragrance of the tea, as if touching the warm ceramic to his lips would break the spell. An attitude of prayer, and he thought he could see Nagare's breath, hot, twining with the steam from the cup. And then Nagare suddenly exhaled, and Tatsumi realized he had been holding his breath. He turned to stare at his own tea, and pressed his lips to the lip of the cup, and thought how hard it was, how unyielding. Thoughts flowed unwelcome through his mind. How long had it been since he had been kissed, or since he had kissed somebody? He sighed and sipped. It was bitter, sharp, and medicinal, and he realized that Nagare must have drunk from it every day, the same bitter cup. I'm sorry, Nagare's voice cut through his revive. I should have had the servant make you something else. This is my medicine. A strange sound rumbled through his throat, and it took a moment for Tatsumi to recognize it as something that was nearly laughter. It's all right, Tatsumi said, unnerved that Nagare had been observing him as acutely as he had been observing Nagare. Just different. Bitter. And it only gets more bitter as it cools. Nagare set it down, close enough to the edge of the porch for a stray raindrop to fall in. He stared at the symmetrical ripples, and then drew the cup back closer to himself. Tatsumi's mouth moved slightly, feeling as though he should say something, but there was nothing to be said. So he drank the tea, and in time, as it cooled, Nagare brought the cup up to his lips and drained the cold, bitter tea in a single draught. They sat that way for a long time, watching the rain fall. As it grew darker, the storm intensified, the wind picked up, and the tops of the trees swayed mercilessly. Nagare stared with bright eyes, mouth half-parted, as fingers of lightning reached down to touch the ground, and the rumble of thunder grew intense, shaking the rafters. We should go inside, Tatsumi finally said as a gush flashed rain onto them, dampening their clothes. He turned away at another gust, cupping a hand over his eyes to keep his glasses from being speckled with rain. Yes, but Nagare made no move to go until a servant came in briefly to light the lamps. As they went back inside, Tatsumi paused to close the wooden doors, sliding them shut as the wind shook the building. He frowned, realizing his white shirt was nearly transparent where it had soaked through, the ends of his dark hair dripping wet along the tatami. Nagare's step faltered, and quickly Tatsumi caught him by the elbow, steadying him. Are you all right? It's nothing, a little stiffness from sitting too long. Nagare's mouth was drawn in a thin, tight line. I'm fine, just not as young as I used to be. Still, shall I call for a servant to take you to your quarters? Tatsumi tried to keep his voice neutral, not wanting to appear over-solicitous and touch on that quirky Kurosaki pride. It's all right. But just as Nagare moved to brush Tatsumi off, and just as Tatsumi stepped forward to steady him, a flash of lightning blinded the room. Simultaneously, a crack of thunder shook the entire house. They stumbled together, Nagare's weight colliding with him as his legs failed, and they fell in a tangle to the floor. The electricity blinked and then died, plunging the room into darkness. Skin-on-skin contact, and Tatsumi gasped, realizing how cold Nagare was, as if burning from within by ice, and for a moment he felt as if he were falling into the shadow that was Nagare, falling in until he felt his lips touch Nagare's in a brief touch of flesh that made his breath catch in his throat. "Master, mid-apology, and then Nagare's lips brushed his, tentatively, testing, before drawing him into a slow, deep kiss that made the blackness of the room seem complete, a totality of night. His hands touched wet bandages, felt the slippery, rough scales beneath them that he had thought he had only imagined seeing. His fingers touched water-slicked hair, long and honey gold, but it slithered through his fingers like silk, and it seemed that in the darkness those long tresses must also be black. They stayed like that for a long moment, exploring each other's lips, Nagare's cold hand running down the damp front of his shirt, teasing past the point of a nipple before cupping the side of his waist with a firm grip. Later, Tatsumi could not have said for certain what he would have done or would not, had not footsteps come running through the hallways, an urgent tattoo that warned them apart before anyone could have seen them. "Master?" a worried, querying voice that Tatsumi identified as Mia. "I am here," Nagare was sitting with stiff formality as the warm glow of the lantern filled the room. "What is it that you need so urgently that you must enter without knocking?" His voice was sharp, severe, and the girl cringed at the reprimand. "I'm sorry, master. I just wanted to see if you were all right. The lightning. As you can see, I am fine. You may leave the lantern and go." His grass-green eyes were unreadable, his hair aglow from the flame of the lantern. Shadows moved strangely over the planes of his face, catching unearthly hollows and angles. "Yes, master," and just as quickly she slid the door closed, and Tatsumi could hear her steps, tentative in the dark, finding their way through the blackness of the big empty house. A faint commotion outside. He heard the sound of many voices, calling out and exclaiming a mix of curiosity and fear. Tatsumi stood and drew aside the heavy doors leading into the garden. The servants were on the far side of the courtyard. He could just barely see their moving silhouettes through the darkness, lit from behind by the weak glow of lanterns and candles. They were pointing. One of the big trees in the center was blasted by lightning, still smoldering in the storm-lit night. It had cracked in half down the center. "So it hit the tree," Tatsumi marveled. "We're lucky that it didn't collapse onto the house." He shut the doors firmly, pausing to straighten the smooth wood when one caught at the edge of the lintel. But when he turned, Nagare was gone. So, I like this story. There's no sex in it. It's a simple scene with a simple setting that describes two characters that in the comic seem to maybe have an interest in each other. It's very faint, but Tatsumi in the book shows strong interest, sudden strong loyalty to Hisoka's father, who is Nagare. And it's interesting, I think, since Tatsumi is technically, I think he's supposed to be like 100-something years old, technically, but he doesn't look any older than like 29 or so. And of course, he appears just as human as Nagare. So, so for me personally, I like Nagare is a father. He's probably in his 50s or so. If not 50s, anywhere from 45 to 50. And while technically Tatsumi is would be the older partner, he looks young. I just have like this aesthetic. I like an older, younger pairing. Even if the younger looking partner is actually older than the the older partner. It's just, I couldn't explain to you why I have a preference for that. Except, it's hard to find older men in yaoi. Like, for some reason, a lot of people want to stay away from that. For them, for some reason, it's not very appealing. And there must be something wrong with you if you're a young person into older people. You must be a gravedigger. Heaven forbid you actually find them attractive and, want to date them or something. I mean, not saying, douchebags like that don't exist, but I personally want to see more variety in yaoi pairings, or even het pairings, or, if you like Yuri, Yuri probably has the same problem. I don't read a lot of Yuri unless it happens to be Sailor Moon or Bubblegum Crisis, but, older younger pairings are not of the devil. Older people are just as hot as younger people. In fact, that there is a charm being with, I think in a story at least, concept-wise, being with an older partner as opposed to a younger one, because an older partner, they've lived longer and in theory have been married, had kids, had plenty of sex, and they would have a kind of toned down sensuality about them that to me personally would just seem really romantic. I mean, rushing into things and being very passionate and hard pounding, is appealing as well. But if I'm really going to talk about what I myself prefer, I think I would like a slow, sensual evening with a gentleman who is devoting his time to me. A lot of people just focus on the sex. They don't really focus on the mutual attraction, if there is such a thing. A lot of stories are just like, this guy's hot, let's throw them together and have them boink each other's minds out. Which, that's okay. But the opposite side of the spectrum, I would like to see more easygoing, sensual, beautifully illustrated stories like this. This wasn't very long, and this was just nicely done. Some of the description, I feel, is a little wonky. Could have been a little better, like at the beginning. We're trying to describe them, I think, sitting out on the porch. Could you call that a porch of a traditional Japanese house? I'm not really sure. But it doesn't really establish, much. It's like we're sitting on tatami that's sitting on a cobbled floor. Granted, I don't know much about Japanese houses, but I don't think they use cobble. I really don't know. So that didn't really describe things well for me. But I think, in my opinion, the rest of the story and imagery is gorgeous. Maybe they should have spent a little more time fine-tuning some of the early description with Tatsumi sitting there and, watching, just enjoying the countryside. I think it's effective in showing that there is a mutual attraction between him and Nagare. And then of course it's a little cliche, but it's nice to see that that even though they stumble into each other comically to an extent. It's a cliche thing to do. Tatsumi just kisses him. He doesn't think about it. He's just like, I want this. So he, gently kisses him. And Nagare is like, I can do this. And so he kisses back. And so then they have this nice kiss where, Tatsumi even says, narrator helps explain, like, Tatsumi couldn't say what he would or wouldn't have done, had the servants not showed up. Me personally, I would like to think that they would have had. I mean, granted, this would have been in the middle of the hallway, but I would have liked them to, have passionate but slow building sex. Just me, because Nagare is hot, and I'm sorry if you disagree, but he is hot. And I think it's nice that the author decides not to continue it past this point, because in reality, there's no way Tatsumi and Nagare could get together and have a relationship, or at least not at this point in time, because for those who don't know anything about the Yami no Matsue universe or Descendants of Darkness universe, it's a supernatural detective mystery horror thing where the main characters are Shinigami, and not like Death Note Shinigami, but like hot Shinigami, where basically when people die, they go to Hades, and then they stand trial where their goods and bads that they've done throughout their life, are judged. And basically, then do you go to heaven or do you go to hell? But the aspect of actually being judged and going to heaven and hell and things like that isn't what the story is about. The story is about the Shinigami themselves and their assignments. So, I'm not exactly sure what book it starts in. I'm going to say book 10 or 11 of Descendants of Darkness. Tatsumi used to be a Shinigami. They're sort of like police officers, but if you miss your dead appointment or you died but your soul is missing, they go to investigate because they have to. Their job is to get your soul and then bring it to judgment, and that's all they do. All they're supposed to do anyway. And so Tatsumi used to be a Shinigami, but but it just didn't work out. He just was not. He didn't. After being after being Tezuki's partner, it just didn't work, and he eventually became the secretary of the Ministry of Hades, or the Japanese division of Ministry of Hades. And so that's his job at throughout the entire story. But but they're short-staffed as well as short-funded. So Watari, who's another Shinigami that rarely has an assignment, from my interpretation, he gets an assignment which they later find out is, it's to investigate Hisoka's father. But Shinigami work in pairs, and since everybody else is busy doing stuff or recuperating after the giant story arc with Meraki that Tatsumi and Hisoka had, because that was a huge event where Shinigami, who can't be killed, almost actually got killed. But anyway, I'm sidetracking. So the chief sends Tatsumi with Watari, and they pretend to be human, and Watari pretends to be a doctor, and Tatsumi's supposed to be the doctor's assistant. And over time, as they're investigating, which happens to be Hisoka's father and Hisoka's family in general, they learn some stuff. It's pretty good. Currently unfinished, but she's slowly, getting to it. She had problems with her wrist. The author had problems with her wrist, but anyway, I'm sorry, I'm digressing. And over time, it's not really a whole lot of time that's passed, but suddenly Tatsumi shows, he's still doing his job to a degree, but he has a loyalty to Nagare that, like, I mean, it doesn't even take months. It just happens. Like, he's suddenly very loyal to Nagare, and you can tell he cares a lot for him. And it's questionable that maybe he, why would he suddenly feel so strongly about him, aside from maybe he has feelings for him. It's not really explained well as to why Tatsumi suddenly has such strong feelings towards Nagare, but I think this is a nice interpretation of that maybe it is romantic feelings. I'm so sorry that I did this all in a long-winded way. I'm really sorry for wasting your time. But I hope you really like this story, and maybe you'll go read it on your own or share it with people. Because Yami no Matsue, or Descendants of Darkness fandom in general, needs more love. Especially since the author is back from hiatus now that her wrist, her hand, which was broke, is now seems to be mended well enough to draw. If you do decide to pick up Yami no Matsue, be aware that only volumes 1 through 11 were published in America, or at least English. You could probably get this other places other than America. And I don't think, and there was technically a 12th volume that got published in Japan but was never published here anywhere else. And it's Viz Media, that published it. I'm not sure if Viz is still going or if they're defunct now. I haven't been able to buy manga, much for a long time now, so I'm really out of date with who's still running and publishing what. But Viz Media published 1 through 11. There's an untranslated volume 12, and she is currently writing, I'll add the information into the video, but she is currently slow, but she's going more chapters of Yami no Matsue, so it's back from hiatus. I will have links and information for you in the video and description down below, so you can find scanlations of the new chapters, and maybe you can find the books online to publish and read. I really recommend it. I really like Yami no Matsue, and I look forward to seeing the current story arc finally finished, and what's going to happen from there on. And I'm still curious about what happened to Dr. Muraki and things like that. But I love the original story. I love this fanfic. Really paints a marvelous, beautiful picture, in my opinion. And I hope that if you've never heard of Yami no Matsue or Descendants of Darkness, you'll pick it up and enjoy it just as much as I do. So, I'm Caleb, and this has been I Love Fanfiction. Thank you for listening. Bye!